Hey everyone, Kira here, and welcome to the episode on the menu bombings, or Operation Menu, I guess. Here's the thing. Before we begin, I wrote this as I was researching, so there's a lot of spirals and different directions that this episode takes. It's not always in the proper order, nor do some of the connections make sense, but this was the way my mind was working. I would research one thing, so I started off with the menu bombings. Then I would find a concept I didn't know, like the Tet Offensive, so I would research that. And then I would find another term I didn't know, so I would research that, and on and on and on. So the original topic of this episode was just the menu bombings, but I do go off on a few various causes and effects, so it's not just all the menu bombings, if that makes sense. On that note, I'm assume some of you don't know the Vietnam War particularly well. Neither do I, to be honest, but because of that, I'll just give a quick overview, and this one will actually be quick, about what's going on before Operation Menu begins. Technically, I think the US had 5 presidents during the Vietnam War, but we'll start with Lyndon B. Johnson, who served from 1963 to 1969. Johnson, in many ways, seems to have escalated the US's involvement in Vietnam. He was a believer of the containment/domino theory, so if one country falls to communism, so will the rest, and so approved a number of plans that increased US commitments in Vietnam. The US did fight on the side of South Vietnam, and that's probably important to mention, against the communist forces of North Vietnam. At some point, you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which, in all fairness, deserves an episode on its own, so I won't get into details, but that essentially acted as a reason to kind of declare war. I say kind of because I don't believe the US actually officially declared war in Vietnam. They just said that they were allowed to take any military measures to keep the peace in Vietnam under the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, I believe, which was eventually repealed, but I don't know. Anyways, a lot happened under Johnson, including Operation Rolling Thunder, the order for sustained bombing across Vietnam, which kind of sets the stage for Operation Menu. There are a lot of operations, just get used to it. Sorry. There's a lot of debates over the US's involvement, or there was a lot of debates over the US's involvement with Vietnam. So Johnson decided not to pursue actually a second term as president, and Richard Nixon wins the presidency in 1969. So with that as our background, the menu bombings were a part of a covert mission of the US Air Force from 1969 through 1970 over Cambodia and Laos. The menu bombings were under Richard Nixon, who, in close consort with the National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, conducted a plan to bomb Cambodia in the hopes of reducing northern Vietnamese presence in Cambodia. Believed groups such as the Vietnamese Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, which were southern Vietnamese who were allied with the North Vietnamese Communist Forces, and the PAVN, the People's Army of North Vietnam, it was believed that they were harboring/transporting weapons and supplies over the Cambodian border. The Viet Cong attack on Niagara, in South Vietnam, I believe, proved to be a catalyst for Nixon's decision to order these bombings. Without the consent of Congress, Nixon ordered 6 bombings, all named after meals. You have the first one, breakfast, then lunch, which was a bombing on base 609, snack, which was 351, dinner 352, supper 740, and dessert 350. Thus the name Operation Menu. Just a random fact, the pilots threw B-52 bombers in waves of 3s. The first attack was launched on March 18, 1969, on Base Area 353, a supply storage in Cambodia. And overall, Operation Menu lasted for about 14 months, and about 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped, probably more. I can't really emphasize enough how secretive this was. Congress wasn't notified, and for a number of years, a series of intricate reportings, all lies, was what was circulated around the government. The White House mostly Nixon, was the source of deception. Top officials of the USAF, United States Air Force, were deceived, including the Chief of Staff and Secretary, and records were falsified. The Arclight Raids, which were a series of bombings over Southeast Asia to reduce the PAVN units, were used as a cover for the menu bombings. The pilots gave false reports saying they bombed South Vietnam instead of crossing the border. Kissinger is thought to have been certain that they could complete the bombings without the newspapers knowing. I found a quote by Nixon in a book by Rob Kirkpatrick. He said, or Nixon, I suppose, said he wanted, quote, no comment, no warnings, no complaints, no protests, and I mean it, not one thing to be said to anyone publicly or privately without my prior approval, end quote. The knowledge of the bombings weren't even released until Clinton declassified them in 2000. I believe the legality, and I say that in quotes, of the bombing was placed under military necessity or defense of South Vietnam. You see, Cambodia was technically neutral. Norodom Sihanouk, the head of the state of Cambodia, managed to maintain a fragile peace in Cambodia by allowing the North Vietnamese to set up bases inside in exchange for them respecting Cambodia's borders, however that worked. He rejected U.S. assistance and aid, relying on his popularity with the Cambodian people to keep radicals both on the right and left under control. We'll get into the power politics of Sihanouk and Lon Nol a little bit later. It's interesting because initially Nixon actually refused to authorize the drops. General Creighton W. Abrams, who is pegged with having a key role in the bombings and may or may not hold the brunt of the My Lai massacre. I don't have a source for that. I don't know where I got that. Okay, anyways, he recommended that these covert bombings soon after Nixon was inaugurated. Nixon originally was like, oh, maybe not, until the Tet Offensive of 1969. I don't even really know where to begin with this one, so we're actually going to back up a year, where you have the original Tet Offensive that begins in 1968. It was a coordinated series of attacks, over 100 of them by North Vietnam, specifically the Viet Cong and the PAVN, on South Vietnam. It's called Tet as they began on the Vietnamese holiday Tet, which is the celebration of the New Year. What was originally an informal truce on that day was broken by General, and I'm going to butcher his name, by General Vo Nguyen Giap? I'm sorry. Okay, who believed a surprise attack could end the stalemate, cause a revolution in South Vietnam, and turn the war in favor of North Vietnam. They also believed that a strong attack could break the alliance between South Vietnam and the U.S. So, in the early morning of January 30th, 1968, just as celebrations were beginning, the Viet Cong launched their first attack. Right before the attacks, actually, you have one of the bloodiest battles in the Vietnam War, the Battle of the Khe Sanh. And I do promise this is important, although you can see kind of what I'm talking about, the spirals. So the Battle of Khe Sanh was an attack led by the PAVN against a U.S. garrison near the border of Laos. It was a relatively massive attack, although nothing about like what was about to come, and although not entirely unexpected, still relatively damaging. For 77 days, the US and the PAVN fought, the US eventually coming out on top. The US launched Operation Niagara, I told you, a lot of operations, which was a military bombardment focusing on the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. This did place the US in a better position than the North Vietnamese. The thing about the Khe Sanh, however, was it was basically a diversion. While this battle was raging, at the time President Lyndon B. Johnson and General William Westmoreland, who was commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, or the MACV, agreed that the US was to hold this garrison at all costs. Westmoreland... What? Sorry, okay. Westmoreland ordered reinforcements, weapons increases, etc., and focused a large amount of US resources towards holding this base. There may also have been some reputation at stake. Quick disclaimer, I'm kind of hypothesizing. So basically in 1954, the French were in a very similar position regarding a base in Vietnam, with Vietnamese armies fighting to gain more land to increase their status in any future peace negotiations. So the soon-to-be coming Geneva Convention. However, the France were badly defeated by General Giap, I believe, in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So there may have been this pressure to not make the same mistakes, and thus the stronger push military. Actually, the Battle of Khe Sanh was pretty commonly referred to as another Dien Bien Phu, although the outcomes are very different. When the first Tet Offensive began, the U.S. Army was more divided than previously because they were fighting now on multiple fronts. Within 24 hours, cities, towns, embassy buildings, military bases, etc. were attacked, amounting again in over 100 attacks. I'm not sure if turning points is the right word, but there were a number of important battles that certainly shifted the US's view of their role in Vietnam. One was the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and the other was the Battle of Hue. Both, in essence, were a type of wake-up call for the U.S. The public realized that the U.S. wasn't, quote, winning in the way everyone was being told, and in fact, it actually seemed like the Northern Vietnamese had a lot of power. I feel like I have to say at least a little on the Battle of Hue, although I do know that we've diverged quite a bit from the original topic. But just because I think it's telling of a lot of how the Vietnam War played out. So for about 3 months in the South Vietnamese city of Hue, again, I may be pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry, the U.S. Army and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam fought against the Viet Cong and the PAVN. It started on January 31st with the rest of the offensive. The Viet Cong and the PAVN basically assumed military control over the city overnight, and with their flag on top of the citadel began their harsh reign. I was reading, and they had actually managed to set up, I don't know if spies, again, is the right word, but they had infiltrated the city disguised as like laymen and workers. So when the offensive did begin, they already had people inside the city and the citadel. Anyways, patrols and troops roamed the streets, able to take money or food or any resources. Potential Southern Vietnamese or American sympathizers, teachers, religious leaders, and civil servants were forcibly taken, and many were killed and buried in mass graves. I won't go too much, or really at all, into the actual fighting and tactics that went on, but it was brutal. Thousands were left dead or missing, and most of the city, which was once bustling and one of the largest in Vietnam, was left to rubble. As time passed, evidence of the mass graves began to emerge, and there are about 18 mass graves in all. There is some disagreement regarding both numbers and exactly what happened, but most sources agree it was terrible nonetheless. In the end, the U.S. technically won. They gained back all stolen land and beat back the Northern Vietnamese army. However, a lot of psychological damage was done. The Viet Cong and the NAVN gained power and belief over their abilities, while the U.S. started falling into an anti-war divide, which hurt war efforts. Slowly rounding back to Operation Menu. Yes, So yes, this is all the first Tet Offensive, but Johnson leaves office in January of 1969. Nixon succeeds him a month before the second Tet Offensive begins. So, a full year after the original Tet Offensive, attacks by the northern Vietnamese are mounted once again, this time focusing on bases in Saigon and Da Nang. Although again beaten back by the US and South Vietnamese, these attacks furthered the idea that the North Vietnam had more power than previously thought. Finally, doing a full loop, the second Tet Offensive acted to convince Nixon to allow the menu bombings. The impact of the menu bombings, and I suppose the bombing of Cambodia in general, is and was huge, and also quite debatable, so be nice. I suppose one of the most immediate or detrimental consequences, apart of course from the major loss of life, was the start or the worsening of the Cambodian Civil War. Now, this technically came after Operation Freedom Deal, when the bombing area in Cambodia was enlarged. This essentially further disrupted the political tensions in Cambodia, and again, although debatable, arguably led to the takeover of the Khmer Rouge. I'm going to try to simplify this, but there's a lot. So, as mentioned earlier, Cambodia was under the rule of Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who tried to run a neutralist country, until 1970, when Sihanouk was overthrown by Lon Nol, which the CIA may or may not have helped with. The US did openly support Lon Nol, and eventually housed him for exile, but there is a lot of debate over whether the CIA was actively involved in this military coup. There's a lot of evidence that says yes, and there's also a lot that says no. So, anyways, so Sihanouk allied with the Khmer Rouge after he was exiled. And the Khmer Rouge was the communist wing of Cambodia. They used the popularity of Sihanouk to increase their own, and as the years went on, their support rose. So they were using each other for political and public gains. After 5 years of a civil war, 500,000 Cambodians dead, the Khmer Rouge eventually managed to take control of, of Phnom Penh? I feel bad. Anyways, the capital, and thus established control over all of Cambodia. Lon Nol is captured or flees or is exiled, mixture of all. And notably, contrary to common belief, or at least what was common belief, the Khmer Rouge opted actually not to place Sihanouk back in power, instead placing Pol Pot, a communist who hoped to attain an agrarian utopia. He didn't. For about 4 years, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot ruled a brutal dictatorship. The country was renamed the Democratic Kampuchea, and the calendars were reset to year 0. He was responsible for the Cambodian genocide, a mass killing over his 4 years aimed at purifying the Cambodian race and, again, creating this utopia. Everything was controlled by the state, and anyone who served as a potential threat, I say threat in quotes, these people included doctors, social workers, and teachers, basically any educated individual, were forced into hard labor and detention camps, the most famous being the S21 jail. The dead were placed in mass graves named the Killing Fields. Estimates on how many died ranges, but common numbers seem to place the dead anywhere from 1.7 million to about 3 million, with what I could find the common average being about 2.2 million. Throughout Pol Pot's entire reign, there had been pretty constant fighting among the border. On January 7th, 1979, with over 60,000 troops and aerial support, the Vietnamese managed to take back the capital, and Pol Pot fled. He actually continued his insurgency and fighting until about 1997, when he was ousted and placed under house arrest. He was meant to face trial, but died at home in 1998. Turning back to the consequences, there's debate over whether or not the bombings actually did anything positive. As you just heard, the fighting didn't really stop after the many bombings, and another interesting effect was the bombings actually seriously increased anti-war feelings. A lot of media outlets were covering the bombings, not the many bombings. Obviously those were secret, but the Vietnam War in general, and this new military tactic, I guess, of just blanket bombing. The glorification of war was diminished, and more and more people began realizing the futility of the Vietnam War. And here's where you have really hundreds, I suppose, of protests, most notably at schools and colleges, actually. And as the years passed and more information began appearing, support continued to decrease. I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure how to end this episode. My mind is slightly fried, and there's still so much stuff I could talk about, and I'm not even sure if I talked about the menu bombings enough to name this episode that. I know I'll revisit Vietnam in the future. It's something I find incredibly depressing, but also interesting. There were a lot of decisions that went into this war, and personally I think it's incredibly important to really understand how it happened, so we can prevent this type of mistake from happening again. And with that, I leave you. I'll see you all soon.